Who says you need to be a boss painter to get good results? Big heads, that's right, knobs, a lot of them. Let I, Ben Jai then, serve as encouragement to you, dear listener. Welcome to Marvel Crisis Protocol's Spider-Man Speed Painting Guide for the casual painter. And disclaimer, I'm not a pro painter, but one thing I can reliably proclaim is that the learning curve to make a miniature look good on the tabletop is not as slippery as you might think. So let's sit you on the seesaw right between speed and quality. At the core of this guide and what we'll be using is the Citadel Contrast paint range, which more often than not allows you to get the same effect as applying a base coat and a wash all in one go, saving us vital time in this here endeavour. But because you might already have or prefer a different range of paints, we'll pop the names of the closest equivalents up on screen as we go. First things first then, you need to prime your model. We're opting to use the complimentary Wraithbone spray can as it gives you a more natural and organic look when the contrast is applied. Of course, if you plan to use a different type of primer, make sure it's a white or off-white because these paints do not work on darker tones. Time to start with the most annoying part of the model with a base paint Abaddon black. Obviously any black will do, but contrast just won't cut it with these fine lines. So make sure you get the paint on your brush like you would conventional acrylic, using your palette to take off any dollops of paint and massage the brush tip to a fine point. The trickiest part of this point is identifying the borders of the costume where red will ultimately meet blue, and this is most tricky around the arms. So take your time as this will be the most onerous section of the whole sitting. You'll also need to border up the eye placements as well, and I'm reasonably confident you can do a better job than me on their shape. But you can also fine tune your lines by going back over any mistakes with some Wraithbone or primer equivalent. Now we get some contrast Black Templar for the spider on the chest and the one that I managed to miss initially on the back. I would suggest paint this in the same manner as if you were highlighting. The legs that spring out from the body of the spider are quite thin, so again don't be too miffed or disappointed by needing to go back over the model. If you let the paint get too far, and also be rest assured that we're doing these fiddly bits first so we can make life easier for ourselves as we make our way around the model. A pretty easy step so long as you've got a steady hand with a nickel bit of white scar or equivalent in the eye slits. There's nothing stopping you doing a couple of coats of this if you needed to round out the curved lines on the inside, instead of faffing with the Wraithbone like in the previous step. Once you're satisfied, let's get the hell out of Finicky Town. With some Flesh Tearers red for the red parts of the costume. You'll know that Spidey red is definitely a tinge darker than your average red bear, so Flesh Tearers felt like the right choice. This is where all the hard work pays off, because you should have no trouble applying a medium amount of contrast on your brush and having at it. You'll find that all the grooves will make this process an enjoyable one. Just be wary, like always, with contrast of any unwanted pooling in those recesses. Up next was Assaman Blue for the blue parts of the costume. Just as liberating and enjoyable as the previous step, but the lesser curves found on the legs require a bit more attention, as you want to avoid going over the same part of the model multiple times, as contrast gets a bit shirty when you do that. So plan ahead, keep a medium amount of paint on the brush for each section, and try and keep the brush on the model constantly as you paint across it. That finishes the body for now, so we turn our attention to the base with some brass scorpion on the steel beam. A layer paint because metallics and flat surfaces are not contrast paint's best friend. You can obviously opt for a silver or any type of brass paint for this step, but I went for something that would look distinct from the rest of the base. Speaking of which, another non-contrast paint and my go-to silver base paint, Lead Belcher, is on hand for the metal parts of the base, and I'm sure you don't need any semi-pro tips for this bit. Finally for the base we have some Basilicanum Grey for the whole of the rest of it. On a relatively fat space you will see some pooling in random places, but make sure there's nothing too egregious, and Bob's your uncle. And this will have the dual use of acting as a wash of sorts for the metal grating. And there you have Spider-Man tabletop ready in no time at all. Yes, contrast paints can require some getting used to, but they're still an excellent tool for casual painters. Now, whilst that might more than meet your needs, we're going to continue with Spidey on the paint station and add a few highlights and finishing touches to the model. Here with some non-contrast paints. Again, nothing too excessive in the spirit of this video, but for just a little extra effort, we can bring some real pop to the model. For the Spider Red, we went with a layer paint, Evil Sun's Scarlet, to highlight each patch, if you like, of the torso, head, gloves and feet. This part will be moderately time consuming, but don't obsess too much getting it perfect, just make sure you avoid painting in those recesses. For the blue highlight, we opted for Techless Blue, bringing a bit of brightness back to the somewhat dull contrast we applied initially. The first highlight on legs tends to cover a decent chunk of the model, so just focus on the areas that would likely be in direct sunlight and only liberally apply the paint elsewhere. Stratum Grey was used to dry brush the concrete parts of the base, and here you'll also see the concrete runs into the metal, so be a bit more patient the closer you get to the other parts of the model. You'll see we also took the Abaddon Black from earlier and finished off the side of the base. One final step saw us apply a light dry brush of lead broacher to bring some pop back to the metal. Remember to get all that paint off the brush before doing the back and forth, and then we added some highlights to the steel beam. Here plumping for some Gehenna's Gold, which is a fairly muted gold, but the contrast with the brass injected a bit of life back into the base. All in all, a nice way to wrap a little bow around the project. And that, as they say, is proof that you don't need to be an expert to get good results. I'm sure many of you will be happy with just the contrast paint steps, but it just goes to show what can be achieved with minimal time investment either way. Stay tuned for more speed painting guides. Alas, I've been the voice in your head, and this video has ended.